The tension within the small gathering was a tangible force, a silent scream that echoed in the hearts of those huddled in the hidden corner of the city. They did not speak of the architecture of the building or the texture of the floor beneath them, for such things had ceased to matter in the face of imminent erasure. Instead, they spoke of a letter that had arrived like a torch carried into a deep cave. The words of the letter were not mere philosophy. They were a lifeline cast into a sea of rising shadows. Your support gives a voice to these ancient echoes and brings strength to those standing in today's invisible storms. Please hit the like button and subscribe so we can continue to unveil the truths that the world often tries to keep in the shadows. Stay with us until the end, for you will not believe the distance this journey of faith truly travels. One man, his voice a mere whisper that barely carried to the person beside him, spoke of the property they had lost. He spoke of the homes confiscated by the empire and the names that had been erased from the public records. He asked how they could continue to walk when every visible path had been blocked by the decree of an angry king. A woman whose eyes held a fire that the threat of death could not extinguish answered him with a single word from the scroll substance. She explained that the faith they carried was not a vaporous hope or a fleeting emotion. It was the title deed to a reality that the Roman soldiers could not touch. She spoke of the ancient legal contracts, the documents that proved ownership of land even before the owner set foot upon the soil. This, she argued, was their current state. They held the deed to a kingdom that was not built with hands. The external world was collapsing. Their friends were being dragged into the arenas, and the quiet footsteps of the guards seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Yet they chose to stand upon a foundation that remained unseen. The conversation turned to the nature of evidence. They debated how proof could exist without physical manifestation. If the world demanded a sign, they had none to give that the world would recognize as valid. Yet the conviction within them acted as a courtroom verification. They were responding to the voice of the Creator as if it were more real than the iron of the swords at their throats. They acknowledged the storm that was breaking over their heads, but they refused to let the storm define the outcome of their journey. The dialogue moved toward a total surrender of the senses. They decided in that hour of great peril that to see with the eyes was to be deceived by the temporary, while to see with the soul was to grasp the eternal. They were not pretending that the danger was small. They were declaring that their God was greater than the visible catastrophe. They understood that faith was what remained when feeling had nothing left to provide. As the night deepened, the consensus among them was clear. They would not seek a comfortable exit from their trials. They would instead seek a deeper anchoring. They were the original readers of the promise, a people bruised by persecution and exhausted by trials they had never requested. Yet they stood at the doorway of a world invisible to the natural eye, holding tight to the substance of things hoped for. They were no longer defined by their status in Rome, but by their standing in the heavens. Long before the first cry of a newborn or the first drop of rain touched the soil, there was a silence that stretched across the infinite void. This silence was not an absence of sound, but a preparation for a frequency that would reorganize the nothingness. The narrative shifts from the suffering in the city to the grand design of the beginning. We consider the moment when the worlds were framed by a single utterance. This was the ultimate foundation of the unseen reality. Everything that the human hand could touch and every mountain that the human eye could behold had its origin in a voice that commanded obedience from the emptiness. The visible was not manufactured from the visible. It was birthed from the heart of a God who spoke and waited for the vacuum to respond. The logic of creation was not an explosion of chaos, but an intentional structuring of order. The world was arranged, aligned, and adjusted by a strategic command. This meant that the universe was not a collection of random accidents, but a carefully framed house for the human story. The elders of old understood this principle before they ever faced their own personal battles. They realized that if God could frame the cosmos, He could surely frame their individual lives. This understanding did not come through the study of matter, but through the exercise of trust. They recognized that the physical universe was built from invisible forces and divine laws, that the physical world could never cancel or override. As the word went forth, the void began to take shape. Light traveled because it was told to move. Time stretched because it was given a boundary. The universe obeyed a voice that no physical ear had yet been formed to hear. The early believers drew strength from this metaphysical truth. They lived in a world where empire seemed unpredictable and life felt fragile, yet they anchored their minds in the God who did not panic when the world felt unstable. They saw that the same voice that stabilized the stars was the same voice that whispered peace into their confusion. The storm of creation was the first evidence that God works best in the dark and the empty. The internal world of the believer was reshaped by this revelation. They began to see that if unseen forces could shape the visible reality of the heavens, then the unseen force of faith could reshape the visible story of their own lives. They were retraining their internal systems to respond to the Creator's voice louder than the panic of their circumstances. If a person believes their life is governed by chance, they will collapse in the face of a storm. But if they believe that existence itself bends around the Word of God, they begin to see that the one shaping their story is not yet finished speaking. The architecture of the Word was the first and final proof that the invisible is the only thing that truly lasts. The mystery of the first altar did not reside in the wood or the flame, but in the internal weight of the offering. Abel understood a truth that his brother Cain had chosen to ignore, that the Creator did not evaluate the hands first, but the heart that moved them. Abel approached the moment of sacrifice with a profound sense of surrender, choosing to give the firstborn the best and the costly. He brought that which could not be easily replaced, a living life offered as a substitute for his own. His faith was not a blind ritual, but an instinctive perception of a pattern that would eventually echo through the corridors of eternity. He sensed that to approach the Holy One must recognize the gravity of the separation and the necessity of a life given. Cain, however, brought the fruit of his labor as a matter of convenience. His contribution was a decorative gesture, something he could regrow and replace without personal cost. The tension between the two brothers was not about the quality of their items, but about the posture of their souls. When the witness of righteousness fell upon Abel, it was a divine testimony that his trust was real. He did not seek to make himself righteous through performance. He simply aligned his will with the divine requirement. The conflict that followed was the inevitable friction between a heart that had surrendered and a heart that had merely pretended. Abel's offering exposed the shallow nature of Cain's devotion, and the resulting rage was the sound of a man who refused to look into the mirror of his own deficiency. Even as the silence of death claimed Abel, the Scripture declares that he continued to speak. His faith became a voice that time could not silence. He had built no cities and conquered no nations, yet his memory remained as a declaration that God measures value by trust rather than by visible outcomes. The blood that was shed did not signify the end of his story, but the beginning of a testimony that would carry through generations. He became the first hero of the unseen world, proving that a life of surrender, however short, carries more weight in heaven than 1,000 years of human achievement. He left behind an echo that reminded all who followed that the first step of faith is the willingness to offer God the first, the best, and the unrecoverable. The lesson of Abel was a sharp warning to the residents of the shadows. It told them that faith was not a spiritual ornament, but a fundamental orientation of the soul. It taught them that God is not impressed by the magnitude of a gift, but by the depth of the trust behind it. Abel had grasped a truth before any doctrine was written or any law was carved into stone. He owned a surrender that transcended theology. As the early believers pondered his story, they realized that their own lives were being measured by the same standard. They were being asked to offer their best in a world that demanded their worst, knowing that even if their voices were silenced by the sword, their faith would continue to speak long after their breath had departed. As the world around him matured in wickedness and the imagination of man grew increasingly dark, Enoch began a journey that defied the trajectory of his generation. He did not seek to impress the world with grand sermons or heroic feats of strength. His faith was expressed through a consistent and quiet movement in the same direction as the Creator. He walked with God for 300 years, a duration that suggests a deep and unwavering intimacy. In an era where the culture was drifting toward total decay, Enoch's walk was a silent protest against the chaos. He chose nearness over noise, and in that nearness he found a testimony that he pleased the one who had framed the worlds. The requirement to please God was revealed not through achievement, but through trust. Enoch understood that without faith it was impossible to find favor in the eyes of the infinite. He held to two fundamental pillars: that God exists, and that God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. This was a radical internal stance in a world that behaved as though the Creator was either absent or indifferent. Enoch's seeking was not a frantic search, but a deliberate pursuit of presence. He did not negotiate with the darkness or compromise with the standards of his day. He moved each day with the awareness that the unseen reality was more substantial than the visible corruption surrounding him. The mystery of his departure remains one of the most unnerving events in human history. Because he walked so closely with the divine, he eventually crossed the boundary that separates time from eternity without passing through the gates of death. He was translated removed from the reach of decay because his union with God was already complete. His story suggests that faith is a movement that leads a person out of their former patterns and into a new form of existence. He did not sprint toward a finish line. He simply continued a walk that had begun centuries earlier until the walk itself carried him into the immediate presence of the Creator. He was not found because he had moved beyond the search of those who lived only for the visible. For those huddling in the hidden places of Rome, Enoch's legacy was a reminder that perseverance is the quietest and most powerful form of faith. They were living in a world that was turning colder and heavier, much like the world of Enoch. They realized that their greatest spiritual growth was not happening in moments of triumph, but in the moments when they refused to quit. They were learning to take the next step even when they did not understand where the path was leading. If Enoch could please God through a simple walk, then they too could please Him by maintaining their nearness in the middle of their own storm. The translation of Enoch was the final proof that those who walk with God will eventually be found where God is, regardless of the darkness they must pass through to get there. The whisper that reached Noah was not a gentle suggestion, but a divine warning concerning realities that had no precedent in the natural world. He was told of a storm that would reorganize the face of the earth, yet at the time the word was spoken, the sky had never surrendered a single drop of rain. Noah was asked to prepare for a catastrophe that his eyes could not imagine, and his experience could not validate. The tension of his life became the gap between the divine decree and the observable horizon. His response was not a series of questions or a request for evidence, but a movement fueled by reverence. He began to build not because he saw the clouds, but because he heard the voice. The building of the ark became a labor that stretched across decades, a slow and rhythmic testimony to a future that the rest of the world mocked. Every piece of timber he fastened and every coat of pitch he applied served as a silent indictment of the corruption surrounding him. The psychological pressure was immense. He lived in a society where violence was the standard and where the imagination of the heart was exclusively dark. His neighbors watched his daily toil with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They saw a man wasting his life on a vessel for an ocean that did not exist and a flood that defied their logic. Yet Noah did not negotiate with their ridicule. His conviction was not fueled by public approval, but by a secret agreement with the Creator. As the years turned into decades, the isolation of his task grew heavier. He had to sustain his obedience long after the initial excitement of the revelation had faded. His faith was not a momentary burst of energy, but a long endurance. He taught his family to trust in the invisible warning, creating a shelter of belief for his household before the first thunderclap ever shook the air. He understood that his obedience was not merely for his own survival, but for the preservation of a remnant. His work was a protest against the immediate ease of his culture. He chose the exhaustion of the hammer and the saw over the comfort of a world that refused to listen. By the time the preparation was complete, Noah had become an heir of righteousness that comes through trust. He had demonstrated that true faith acts when the sun is shining and the danger is hidden. His life proved that a person could be right in their assessment of reality even when the entire world declared them insane. The ark was not just a boat, it was a physical manifestation of an internal certainty. When the boundaries of the deep finally broke and the windows of the heavens were opened, the tragedy of the world was not just the water, but the fact that they had watched the preparation for a lifetime and still refused to believe. Noah entered the rest of his God knowing that his long obedience had been the only rational response to an irrational world. The command that came to Abraham was a violent disruption of everything he considered stable. He was a man of high standing in the city of Ur, a place of advanced architecture, legal structures, and ancestral roots. His identity was tied to the land of his fathers and the security of his clan. Yet the voice called him to go out into a place that was not yet named to receive an inheritance he could not yet see. The faith of Abraham began with an act of total dislocation. He had to step out of his past to find his future, leaving behind the safety of the known for the terrifying vacuum of the unknown. He obeyed without a map, walking away from the walls of his city, toward a horizon that offered no guarantees. The journey was marked by a persistent state of not knowing. Abraham moved through territories that were not his own, living as a stranger and a pilgrim, even in the lands that had been promised to him. He did not build houses or establish cities. He dwelt in tense structures designed for movement and detachment. This nomadic existence was a deliberate choice to remain unrooted in the temporary world. He understood that if he focused too much on the country he had left, he would eventually find an opportunity to return. His faith was a constant battle against the memory of comfort. He trained his mind to look forward, seeking a city that possessed foundations that no human hand could destroy and no earthly empire could shake. The psychological weight of being a foreigner was a constant companion. He lived among people whose languages, gods, and customs were alien to him. He held on to a promise that felt increasingly distant as the years passed. His life was a paradox. He was a prince of God, living as a landless wanderer. Yet he did not complain about the lack of stability. He realized that the instability of his physical life was sharpening his spiritual vision. He was looking for a builder and a maker who was not bound by the limitations of time. His faith was not a search for a better version of his old life, but a pursuit of an entirely different realm of existence. Abraham's movement created a legacy that would flow through his descendants, Isaac and Jacob. He taught them to live with the same sense of divine displacement, reminding them that they were heirs of a promise that stretched beyond their own heartbeats. They lived as people who were in the world but not defined by it. They embraced the promises from a distance, persuaded of their truth even when the fulfillment remained invisible. Abraham's greatness was not found in his wealth or his power, but in his willingness to remain a stranger for the sake of a word he believed was true. He proved that the most significant journey a person can take is the one where they lose their earthly home to find an eternal one. Sarah resided in a silent chamber of her own soul, a place where hope had been buried under the dust of 90 years. Her existence was defined by a specific kind of emptiness that the ancient world treated as a mark of divine disfavor. To be childless was not merely a private sorrow for her. It was a public humiliation that echoed through the decades of her life. She had watched the seasons turn and the generations rise, all while the silence of her own womb grew louder. By the time the promise of a son was repeated, Sarah was no longer the young woman who dreamt of a lineage. She was a woman whose heart had grown hard as a defense mechanism against the persistent cruelty of disappointment. The struggle Sarah faced was not merely physical, but deeply psychological. She had learned to treat hope as a dangerous intruder, a force that only served to deepen the eventual pain of failure. When she first heard the declaration that she would bear a child in her old age, her immediate response was a laugh. This was not a laugh of joy, but a shield of irony. It was the sound of a woman who had calculated the impossibilities of her own biology and concluded that the time for miracles had long since passed. She knew the limitations of her body and the finality of her age. For Sarah, the idea of a new beginning felt like a mockery of her long and difficult history of waiting. However, the narrative of her faith did not end with her laughter. The internal shift began when she was forced to confront the character of the one who had spoken. Sarah had spent 25 years focusing on the promise itself, measuring its feasibility against her own declining strength. The breakthrough occurred when she shifted her gaze from the promise to the promiser. She began to weigh the integrity of God against the evidence of her own barrenness. The word faithful became the anchor for her soul. She reached a point of internal arithmetic where she decided that the Creator's ability to keep His word was a more substantial reality than her own physical incapacity. She judged Him faithful, and in that judgment the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. This shift in perception allowed a supernatural strength to enter her life. It was not a strength she manufactured through positive thinking or emotional effort, but a divine enabling that responded to her trust. The text describes this as receiving strength to conceive, suggesting that her spirit had to come alive before her body could follow. Her faith did not deny the reality of her 90 years. It simply subordinated that reality to a higher truth. She allowed herself to be vulnerable to hope once more, which was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. The internal resurrection of her expectation was the doorway through which the physical promise finally entered the world. The result of Sarah's faith was a legacy that stretched far beyond the birth of a single child. From a woman who was considered as good as dead in terms of her future, there sprang a multitude as uncountable as the stars in the night sky and the sand upon the shore. Her story serves as a profound interruption to the lie that certain areas of life are forever barren. She proved that God delights in working within the rooms we have already locked and the dreams we have already buried. For the believers in Rome, Sarah's life was a testament that their current exhaustion and their sense of being finished were not the final word. If a 90-year-old womb could become the mother of nations, then their own suffering could surely become the birthplace of something eternal. Sarah's journey teaches that faith is often the conquest of one's own history. She had to let go of the identity of the barren one to embrace the identity of the mother of the promise. Her faith was not the absence of doubt, but the triumph over it through a deep and sober evaluation of God's nature. She did not need a sign or a temporary relief. She needed a conviction that the one who had promised was capable of overriding the laws of nature. As her story concludes, the laughter of disbelief is replaced by the laughter of fulfillment, a sound that echoes the truth that no season is too late and no hope is too dead for the one who frames the worlds. The finality of death arrived for each of them long before the physical manifestation of the promise ever touched their hands. This is the great paradox that the narrative now confronts, that a life can be entirely consumed by faith and yet conclude without the visible reward. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Sarah all reached the end of their earthly journeys, while the fulfillment of the word remained a distant horizon. They died in faith, a state of being that suggests their conviction was not dependent on an arrival, but on a direction. They did not view their lack of possession as a failure of the Creator, but as an indication that the scope of the promise was far larger than the boundaries of a single human lifespan. The internal mechanism of their endurance was a form of spiritual vision that allowed them to see the promise from afar. They were persuaded of the truth not because they could grasp it with their fingers, but because they had welcomed it into their souls. They embraced the unseen realities with a warmth that most people reserve for tangible wealth. This embrace required a radical admission that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They lived with the constant awareness that they were in a state of transit, moving through a world that could not provide the permanence they craved. They refused to anchor their identities in the soil of the temporary, choosing instead to remain unattached to the systems and structures of the passing age. The psychological tension of this pilgrimage was the constant opportunity to return. If their minds had been occupied with thoughts of the country they had left behind, the comfort of or the security of their old clans, the predictability of their former lives, they would have found 1,000 reasons to turn back. The temptation to retreat is always strongest when the path forward is shrouded in silence and the destination remains invisible. However, they deliberately starved their memories of the old comforts. They refused to let the past become a sanctuary. They understood that the desire to return is often a symptom of a heart that has lost its vision of the future. By refusing to look back, they proved that their longing was not for a restoration of the old, but for an inauguration of the new. Their desire was focused on a better country, one that was not defined by borders or guarded by earthly armies. They were seeking a heavenly reality, a realm where the foundations were laid by the Creator Himself. This seeking was not a passive waiting, but an active orientation of every thought and action toward the eternal. They recognized that the storms they faced were merely the turbulence of a world they were passing through. Their dissatisfaction with the earth was not a sign of bitterness, but a sign of alignment. They had been calibrated for a different atmosphere, and their lives were a long and steady march toward the home they had never seen but always recognized. The weight of their commitment led to a staggering divine response that God is not ashamed to be called their God. For the infinite architect of the cosmos to identify himself with a group of wandering, landless, and often persecuted individuals is a reversal of every human concept of status. He did not distance himself from their struggle or their apparent lack of success. He instead claimed them as his own, validating their pilgrimage as the most significant endeavor in human history. He had prepared a city for them, an architectural answer to their lifelong longing. The fact that they did not see this city during their earthly lives did not make the city less real. It simply made their faith more substantial. For those hearing this story in the shadows of the empire, the message was clear and piercing. They were being told that their own sense of displacement and their own unanswered prayers were not signs of abandonment. They were being invited to join the ranks of the heavenly pilgrims, to live as people who are not at home in a world that rejects their master. They were encouraged to embrace the not yet of their circumstances, knowing that their faithfulness was building a legacy that would outlast the stones of Rome. The pilgrimage of the heart was the only path to the country that truly mattered, a journey where the distance is measured not in miles, but in the depth of one's persuasion. The command arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a chilling whisper that seemed to freeze the very foundation of Abraham's world. It was a request that defied the logic of the covenant and the mercy of the Creator to take his only begotten Son, the child of the promise, and offer him as a sacrifice. This was the ultimate trial, a pressure designed to reveal whether Abraham loved the gift more than the giver. Isaac was not merely a child. He was the embodiment of 25 years of waiting and the sole vessel through which the future of nations was to flow. If Isaac were to perish, the promise would perish with him, and the entire trajectory of Abraham's life would collapse into a meaningless tragedy. Abraham did not engage in an outward debate or seek an audience with the heavens to protest the unfairness of the demand. Instead, he entered a state of internal accounting, a sober and deep calculation of the nature of God. He weighed the command against the promise and the character of the one who had spoken both. His mind grappled with a divine contradiction that would have broken a lesser faith. The logic he reached was as profound as it was unprecedented. He concluded that if God were committed to the promise through Isaac, then God was also capable of raising him from the dead. No resurrection had ever occurred in the history of the world, yet Abraham reasoned that death was not an obstacle for the one who had framed the worlds out of nothingness. The journey toward the designated place was marked by a silence that held the weight of eternity. Abraham walked with a resolution that was fueled by this internal arithmetic. He was not moving in blind obedience, but in a calculated trust. Every step toward the altar was a deliberate choice to prioritize the word of God over the evidence of his own emotions. When Isaac questioned the absence of the lamb, Abraham's answer was a prophetic declaration of his own certainty that God would provide for himself a lamb. He was speaking out of a conviction that the Creator's provision would always match the magnitude of the requirement. His heart was anchored in the belief that the promise could not be canceled by the knife. As the moment of sacrifice arrived, the tension reached a point of absolute narrowness. Abraham placed his son upon the wood, a gesture that represented the total surrender of his own future and his own identity. He was willing to let go of the very thing he cherished most because he trusted the one who had given it. The act of lifting the knife was the final proof that his allegiance was undivided. He was stopped not by a change in his own will, but by a divine intervention that acknowledged the completion of the test. The Creator had found a man whose trust was so absolute that it was willing to traverse the territory of death to maintain its loyalty. The ram caught in the thicket became the immediate provision, but the greater revelation was the symbolic resurrection of Isaac. Abraham received his son back as if from the dead, having lived through the internal reality of the sacrifice. He had proven that faith is not about holding on to what we love with a clenched fist, but about holding it with an open hand, trusting that God is the master of life and death. His obedience on that mountain created a pattern that would echo throughout history, foreshadowing a day when another father would offer his only begotten son without withholding the stroke of judgment. For the believers huddling in the hidden rooms of the empire, Abraham's mountain was a mirror for their own trials. They were being asked to surrender their lives, their families, and their safety for a promise they had not yet seen fulfilled. They realized that their own sacrifices were not losses, but investments in a reality that death could not touch. Abraham had shown them that when we place our most precious things upon the altar of God, we do not lose them. We find that they are protected by a power that transcends the grave. The accounting of the altar was the final confirmation that the Word of God is the only currency that retains its value in the face of the ultimate storm. The focus of the narrative narrows from the heights of mountain altars to the quiet, heavy atmosphere of the bedside. 3 generations, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, approached the final threshold of their earthly existence. For these men, the end of life was not a season of resignation or a fading into silence. It was a final focused act of the will. They had spent their years as pilgrims in a land that was promised but never fully possessed. As their physical strength ebbed away, their spiritual vision sharpened. They understood that their lives were merely individual links in a chain that stretched toward a horizon they would never see. Their faith was now expressed through the authority of the spoken word, a final legacy passed into the bloodlines of the future. Isaac sat in a darkness that was both physical and spiritual. His eyes had failed him, leaving him unable to distinguish between the faces of his own children. Yet in this state of sensory deprivation, he was forced to rely on a different kind of perception. He had intended to follow the natural order, seeking to bless his eldest son according to human tradition and personal preference. But the narrative of faith is often a story of divine interruption. Through a series of deceptions and reversals, the blessing was diverted to Jacob. When Isaac realized the truth, he did not rage against the subversion. Instead, he trembled with a sudden, profound clarity. He recognized that his own preferences were subordinate to a higher sovereign plan. By faith, he confirmed the blessing, realizing that God's choice surpassed his own dim sight. He spoke into the future of Jacob and Esau, not as a man granting a wish, but as a prophet acknowledging a destiny. The transition to Jacob's final hours reveals a man who had been thoroughly broken and reshaped by his encounters with the divine. Jacob was the wrestler, the deceiver, who had become the prince. As he lay dying, he did not speak of his own cleverness or the wealth he had accumulated in Egypt. He requested to lean upon the top of his staff, a piece of wood that represented every mile of his long, limping journey. That staff was a witness to the night his hip was dislocated by a divine touch, a reminder that his strength was found only in his dependence. Jacob reached out to bless the sons of Joseph, but in doing so he intentionally crossed his arms. He placed his right hand upon the younger and his left upon the elder, once again overturning the expectations of the world. He was teaching his grandchildren that the favor of the Creator is not earned by birthright, but assigned by grace. His worship was a silent declaration that he had finally learned to trust the wisdom of the one who had guided him through every trial. Finally, the narrative reaches Joseph, a man who had risen to the pinnacle of earthly power. He lived in the heart of the Egyptian empire, surrounded by the opulence of the pharaohs and the security of a kingdom he had saved from famine. Yet Joseph never allowed the comforts of Egypt to dim his memory of the promise. He knew that his people were not meant to be permanent residents of the Nile Delta. As he sensed his departure approaching, he did not leave instructions for a grand pyramid or a monument to his own political achievements. Instead, he spoke of the departing. He issued a command concerning his bones, requiring that they be carried out of Egypt when the time of deliverance arrived. Joseph was looking across 400 years of future history, seeing an exodus that had not yet been conceived. His faith was so absolute that he intended for his very remains to participate in the movement toward the Promised Land. These 3 men proved that faith is not merely for the vibrant years of youth or the dramatic crises of midlife. They demonstrated a faith that persists through the indignity of aging and the certainty of death. They refused to let their final moments be defined by loss. Instead, they used their last words to anchor the next generation in the reality of the unseen. They were passing a baton that was still hot with the fire of the original promise. They died without seeing the land fully possessed, without seeing the nation fully formed, and without seeing the ultimate mediator. Yet they died in peace because they knew that the one who had promised was faithful. For the believers in the hidden corners of Rome, the dying patriarchs were a profound source of courage. They realized that even if they did not survive the current persecution, their deaths could be an act of faith. They saw that to die well is to speak the truth of God's future to those who remain. They learned that they were part of a story that does not end at the grave. The prophecy of the departure was a reminder that every believer is a bridge, and that the greatest work of faith is often the one we do just before we close our eyes for the last time. They were encouraged to look beyond their own immediate survival and to consider the eternal inheritance that awaited all who remained faithful to the end. The narrative of faith moves from the quiet bedside of the patriarchs into a world thick with the suffocating atmosphere of state-mandated terror. A new king had arisen who did not remember the ancient service of Joseph, and his response to the growth of the chosen people was a decree of calculated erasure. It was a time where every newborn cry was a potential death sentence, and where the shadow of the empire fell heavily upon every household. Into this climate of fear, Moses was born. His arrival was not celebrated with public joy, but guarded with a desperate, holy secrecy. His parents looked upon the child and saw more than a son. They perceived a divine purpose that the decree of a king could not invalidate. The faith of Moses' parents was expressed through a 3-month-long defiance of the most powerful man on earth. They were not paralyzed by the threat of execution or the pervasive reach of the king's spies. They chose to hide the child, not out of a frantic desire for survival, but out of a conviction that the life within their home was governed by a higher authority than the one seated on the throne in Egypt. Their lack of fear was not an absence of danger, but a presence of trust. They recognized that to obey the king was to betray the Creator. Their quiet rebellion was the first stage of a deliverance that would eventually shake the foundations of the world. They understood that faith often begins with a refusal to be intimidated by the visible powers of the age. As Moses transitioned from a hidden child to a man of the royal court, he entered a period of intense internal conflict. He had been raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, receiving an education in all the wisdom, arts, and sciences of the Egyptian empire. He moved through the corridors of power with the ease of an aristocrat surrounded by the treasures of a civilization that considered itself eternal. He had access to everything the natural heart desires: prestige, wealth, safety, and a name that commanded respect. Yet as he came to years, the identity of the palace began to collide with the identity of the promise. The luxury of Egypt was a golden cage that required him to ignore the suffering of his own people. The turning point of Moses' life was not a gradual drift, but a decisive refusal. He reached a maturity where he could no longer reconcile the comfort of the crown with the calling of his soul. By faith, he rejected the title of a prince. This was not a rejection of a physical location, but a rejection of a destiny shaped by the world. He looked at the pleasures of sin and recognized their nature. They were temporary, a seasonal satisfaction that would eventually leave the soul bankrupt. He understood that to remain in the palace was to participate in the silence of oppression. He chose instead to identify with the afflicted, preferring the hardship of the slaves over the opulence of the masters. The internal calculation of Moses was based on an evaluation of wealth that the world found incomprehensible. He esteemed the reproach of Christ as being of greater value than the combined treasures of the Egyptian empire. To the natural eye, Moses was throwing away a fortune for a life of shame and difficulty. He was trading a throne for a wilderness. Yet he was not looking at the immediate loss. He was looking at the recompense of the reward. He possessed a form of spiritual sight that allowed him to see the eternal value of suffering for the sake of the truth. He realized that the shame of the world is often the glory of heaven. He was not a man who had lost his mind, but a man who had finally found his vision. This choice was a radical act of dislocation. Moses walked away from the only world he had ever known, not out of fear of the king's wrath, but out of a fixation on the invisible God. He endured the transition from a ruler to a fugitive because he was anchored in a reality that Pharaoh could not touch. His life became a testament that the greatest treasures are not those stored in stone vaults, but those carried in a heart that has been purified by the choice to suffer with the people of God. He proved that faith is the power to say no to the most seductive offers of the world, in order to say yes to the quiet whisper of the Creator. For the believers in Rome, the story of Moses' refusal was a direct challenge to their own temptations. They were living in the heart of another empire that offered them safety in exchange for their silence. They saw in Moses a man who had already faced the ultimate test of status, and won. They realized that their own social exclusion and their loss of property were not signs of defeat, but signs of their participation in the same reproach that Moses had embraced. They were encouraged to look past the visible power of their oppressors and to fix their eyes on the invisible reward. Moses had shown them that to walk away from a palace is the only way to walk toward the kingdom that truly matters. The transition from the comfort of the palace to the brutality of the desert was merely the beginning of the testing of Moses. His faith had already led him to refuse the crown, but now it required him to lead a nation of thousands through the narrow corridor of a divine deliverance. The final night in Egypt was not marked by a physical battle, but by an act of symbolic obedience that defied every human instinct for safety. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood upon the doorposts of the houses. This was not a superstitious ritual. It was a calculated response to a warning of cosmic judgment. He believed that a simple act of trust would distinguish his people from those who faced the coming darkness. He stood within the house, listening to the silence of a night that held the weight of death, trusting that the blood would serve as a boundary the destroyer could not cross. The departure from Egypt was an act of total surrender to an invisible guidance. For centuries, the chosen people had known only the predictable cycles of slavery and the tangible structures of the empire. To leave was to step into a vacuum where their only source of survival was a word spoken from the mouth of the Creator. They forsook the land of their birth not because they had a clear map of the future, but because they were led by a man who saw Him who is invisible. The psychological tension was absolute. They were moving away from the only security they had ever known, however oppressive it had been, and heading toward a wilderness that offered nothing but the promise of God. Their movement was a collective declaration that the presence of the divine was more valuable than the stability of the known world. The ultimate crisis arrived at the edge of the Red Sea. The narrative reaches a point of total impossibility where every human resource was exhausted. Behind them, the thunder of Pharaoh's chariots grew louder, representing the return of the world they had tried to leave. Before them was the vast expanse of the water, a barrier that seemed to finalize their destruction. The people were caught in the grip of a terror that threatened to dissolve their resolve. They questioned their leader and doubted the promise, for their eyes reported only the reality of the trap. Yet Moses stood in a state of supernatural calm. His endurance was not a product of his own courage, but of his vision. He looked at the sea and did not see an ending. He saw a transition. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land. This was the moment where the internal conviction of Moses became a physical reality for the entire nation. He was commanded to move forward, to step into the territory of the impossible before the path was fully revealed. The act of walking between the walls of water was the supreme test of their trust. They had to believe that the voice that had called them out of Egypt was capable of holding back the foundations of the deep. Every step they took was an act of faith, a choice to move through a world that had been temporarily reorganized by the power of the Word. They were walking through a highway of grace that had been carved out of the heart of their greatest obstacle. The contrast between faith and presumption was revealed in the fate of the Egyptian army. The soldiers of Pharaoh saw the path and attempted to follow, but they moved without the authorization of the divine word. They were attempting to use a miracle of faith as a tool of empire. Because they lacked the internal anchoring that Moses possessed, the very path that was a source of life for the faithful became a place of destruction for the arrogant. The waters returned to their natural state, erasing the power of Egypt and finalizing the separation between the people and their past. The sea was not just a barrier. It was a grave for their old identity and a birthplace for their new one. This victory was the definitive proof that faith changes the very environment surrounding the believer. What looks like an ocean of destruction to the world becomes a dry path to the person who walks by faith. Moses had shown that when the visible world presents no exit, the invisible God creates one. The crossing of the Red Sea was the outward manifestation of the internal reality that had been growing in Moses since the day he first refused the treasures of Egypt. He had learned that to follow the Creator is to walk in a reality that the natural mind cannot measure. For the believers huddling in the hidden corners of Rome, the Red Sea was a powerful metaphor for their own circumstances. They felt trapped between the power of the emperor and the certainty of death. They were encouraged to realize that the path of faith often leads into places where there is no human way out. They saw that their own deliverance did not depend on the mercy of their oppressors, but on the power of the one who could split the deep. Moses had proven that even when the world thunders behind you and the ocean bars your way, the only thing that matters is whether you are moving in obedience to the voice of the one who frames the worlds. The narrative shifts from the open expanses of the desert to the shadow of an obstacle that appeared as eternal as the earth itself. The walls of Jericho were not merely a physical barrier of stone and timber. They were a psychological fortification that mocked the very possibility of the promise. To the natural eye, the city was a fortress of absolute security, a monument to human strength that had no visible weakness. The people of Israel stood before this massive obstruction, having survived the sea and the wilderness, only to face a challenge that defied every conventional logic of warfare. They possessed no siege engines, no ladders, and no experience in the art of breaking a walled city. They had only a command that sounded like madness to the ears of a strategist: to march, to remain silent, and to wait. The strategy of the seventh day was an exercise in collective discipline and internal restraint. By faith, the walls fell down, but only after they had been compassed about for 7 days. This period of waiting was the supreme test of their patience. For 6 days they walked in a silence that was more profound than any shout. They were forbidden from speaking a single word, forced instead to listen to the rhythm of their own footsteps and the muffled sounds of the city above them. The soldiers of Jericho watched from the heights, their initial fear likely turning to a mixture of confusion and ridicule. The silence was a form of spiritual warfare, a refusal to engage with the mockery of the world, and a choice to focus entirely on the instruction of the Creator. They were learning that faith is often expressed through the ability to remain quiet while the obstacle remains standing. Within the heart of that doomed city, a different kind of faith was taking root in the most unlikely of places. Rahab was a woman who existed on the margins of her society, someone whose history was marked by the shadows of a difficult life. Yet she possessed a spiritual perception that far exceeded the wisdom of the kings and the generals. She had heard the reports of the Red Sea and the victories in the wilderness, and she reached a conclusion that her own culture refused to acknowledge. She recognized that the God of Israel was the only true authority in heaven and on earth. Her faith was not based on a lifetime of tradition, but on a sober evaluation of the evidence she had received. She chose to align herself with the invisible God rather than stay loyal to a dying empire. Rahab's faith was manifested through an act of dangerous courage. She received the spies with peace, hiding them at the risk of her own life and engineering their escape. She was not acting out of a desire for political betrayal, but out of a desperate hope for a new identity. She tied a scarlet cord in her window, a single thread of color that served as a signal of her surrender and her trust. That cord was a fragile line between life and death, a symbol of a promise that she believed would be honored, even in the middle of a total collapse. She proved that faith is no respecter of background or status. It is a door that stands open for anyone who is willing to believe that the coming judgment can be turned into a personal deliverance. The climax of the seventh day was the moment where the silence finally broke. At the command of the Creator, the people shouted, and the trumpet blast acted as the final frequency that dismantled the foundations of the city. The walls did not fall because of the volume of the noise, but because the period of obedience was complete. The physical barrier collapsed because the internal faith of the people had outlasted it. In the middle of the destruction, Rahab and her household remained untouched, a small island of grace in a sea of judgment. She was not only rescued from the ruins, but was eventually woven into the very lineage of the promise, proving that the Creator delights in using the forgotten and the flawed to accomplish His eternal purposes. For the believers huddling in the hidden places of Rome, the story of Jericho was a profound lesson in the power of endurance. They were surrounded by the massive walls of an empire that seemed unshakable. They were being told that their own silence and their own quiet marches of prayer were not signs of weakness, but instruments of a coming victory. They saw in Rahab a reminder that God's mercy reaches into the most unexpected corners of the world, and that a single thread of faith is enough to hold a soul in the middle of a collapsing civilization. They were encouraged to keep walking, to keep trusting, and to wait for the shout that would eventually signal the end of their own trials. It taught them that faith is the ability to walk around an obstacle until God decides to remove it. The falling of Jericho and the rescue of Rahab were the final declarations that the seen world is always subject to the unseen word. The scarlet thread remained as a testimony that when a heart judges God to be faithful, the entire structure of reality is reorganized to protect that trust. The narrator of the ancient scroll pauses as if the weight of the stories has become too vast to contain. The question arises with a sense of urgent exhaustion. What shall I more say, for the time would fail to tell of every man and woman whose trust became a weapon against the darkness. The history of the promise is not a singular path, but a rushing river of lives that collided with impossibility and refused to break. We are no longer looking at individual giants standing alone on mountain peaks. We are looking at a desperate, surging crowd of the weak, the flawed, and the unlikely who were suddenly transformed by the touch of the invisible. Gideon began his journey not as a warrior, but as a man hiding in a winepress, trying to save a small portion of grain from the eyes of his oppressors. His internal world was dominated by a sense of insignificance. He argued with the divine messenger, claiming that his clan was the weakest and that he was the least in his father's house. Yet faith did not require Gideon to feel strong. It only required him to be obedient. He watched as his army was stripped away from 32,000 down to a mere 300, a number so small it was a mockery of military strategy. His victory was achieved not through the sword, but through the breaking of jars and the shining of torches in the middle of the night. He proved that when human resources are removed, the power of the word becomes the only explanation for the outcome. Beside him stands Barak, a man whose faith was tangled with hesitation. He refused to move unless the prophetess Deborah walked with him, showing that even a trembling trust is still recognized by heaven. His victory was not diminished by his need for a companion. It was simply another example of how the Creator uses the reluctant to achieve the remarkable. Then there is Jephthah, a man born into rejection and cast out by his own family. He was a social exile who spent his years in the wasteland, yet when the crisis arrived, his faith in the God of his fathers made him the only hope for a nation that had once despised him. These men were not polished heroes. They were fractured vessels who became instruments of justice because they refused to let their past define their potential. The narrative reaches David, the shepherd boy, who became the king whose heart was a mirror for the divine. David's faith was not the absence of failure, but the persistence of return. He was a man who understood the heights of worship and the depths of disaster. His trust was forged while facing a giant with a stone and a sling, but it was perfected while hiding in the caves of the desert from a king who sought his life. David proved that the strength of a leader is found in his willingness to lean entirely upon a God who does not judge by outward appearance. He was joined by Samuel the prophet, who heard a voice in the dark while he was yet a child, and spent his life standing before kings without trembling. These were people who subdued kingdoms and wrought righteousness not because they were perfect, but because they were persuaded. The power of their trust manifested in physical interruptions of the natural order. Some stopped the mouths of lions, standing in pits of certain death with a calm that defied the hunger of the beasts. Others quenched the violence of fire, walking through furnaces heated 7 times beyond their capacity, only to emerge without even the smell of smoke upon their garments. They escaped the edge of the sword and turned to flight the armies of the aliens, proving that a single heart aligned with the Creator is a majority in any battle. The most striking line of their history is that, out of weakness they were made strong. Their power was not innate. It was a divine gift that arrived at the precise moment their own strength was exhausted. There were women who received their dead raised to life again, experiencing a reversal of the most final law of nature. They held the lifeless bodies of their children and refused to accept the finality of the grave, crying out until the breath returned. Their faith was a violent protest against the dominion of death. Yet even as these triumphs are recorded, the narrative begins to tilt toward a deeper, more difficult form of victory. The focus shifts from those who escaped to those who endured. We see that faith is not only the power to change the world, but the power to withstand it. The narrative of faith reaches its final and most difficult corridor, where the light of visible victory fades and the brilliance of internal endurance takes its place. We leave the mountains of triumph and the falling walls of fortresses to enter the territory of the others. These were the believers whose stories did not end with an open sea or a shut lion's mouth. They were the ones who faced the ultimate weight of the world's hostility and refused to bend. They were tortured, enduring the systematic breaking of their bodies. Yet they held a secret power that made them unreachable to their tormentors. They were offered deliverance, a chance to walk away from the pain, if only they would renounce the one who had framed the worlds, but they declined. They were fixated on a better resurrection, a life that death could not touch and that no empire could legislate. The cost of their commitment was measured in a series of brutal indignities that the history of the world often tries to forget. They experienced the trial of cruel mockings, a psychological violence designed to erode their sense of identity and worth. They felt the sting of scourgings and the cold weight of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, and they were slain with the sword. These were not just deaths. They were attempts by the seen world to erase the influence of the unseen God. Yet every blow only served to confirm the substance of their hope. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, stripped of their social status and their physical comforts, living as the destitute and the tormented. They were cast out of the cities they had helped to build and forced into the margins of existence. The verdict of heaven upon these wandering exiles remains one of the most staggering declarations in the entire record. The world was not worthy of them. While the earthly powers viewed them as disposable and dangerous, the Creator viewed them as the only ones truly alive. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, finding shelter in dens and caves of the earth. Yet they carried a weight of glory that the palaces of Rome could never contain. Their suffering was not a sign of abandonment, but a sign of their supreme value. They were the salt that the earth rejected, the light that the darkness tried to extinguish, and the witnesses that the generations could not silence. Their lives prove that faith is not a tool for obtaining comfort, but a capacity for maintaining loyalty in the face of total loss. A profound paradox emerges as the list of heroes concludes. Every single one of them, from the triumphant warriors to the broken martyrs, obtained a good report through their faith. God Himself wrote His testimony across their lives, affirming their trust as the most valuable currency in the universe. And yet none of them received the promise in its full physical manifestation during their time on earth. They lived and died as participants in a story that was larger than their own lifespans. They held the title deed to a future they would not inhabit in the flesh. They were the architects of a foundation that was waiting for a final stone to be laid. They were the precursors to a revelation that was still hidden in the mind of the Creator. The final revelation of the narrative is that God had provided some better thing for those who would come after. He had orchestrated history so that the ancient heroes and the modern believers would be perfected together. The story was not meant to be finished without the contribution of the generation that now holds the scroll. The martyrs in the caves and the saints in the arenas were waiting for the completion of the tapestry, a work that requires the participation of every soul that chooses to walk by faith. The ancients provided the shadows and the prophecies, while the current age receives the substance and the fulfillment in the person of the mediator. They are not separate stories, but one continuous movement of the divine will through time. For the believers huddling in the hidden corners of Rome, they realized that they were the answer to the longings of the ancients. They saw that their own trials were the finishing touches on a masterpiece of endurance that began with Abel's blood. They were encouraged to look past their own immediate suffering and to see themselves as part of a great cloud of witnesses that surrounds the world. They understood that their lives were the next line in the most important story ever told. The completion of the unseen tapestry was not a distant event, but a present reality that they were weaving with every choice to remain faithful. The narrative concludes not with an ending, but with a beginning. The torch of faith carried through the fire and the flood through the palace, and the prison is now handed to the reader. The history of the promise remains an open book, waiting for the next act of trust and the next refusal of the world's seductions. The Great Hall of Faith is not a museum of the past, but a living sanctuary for the present. As the silence falls upon the final words of the scroll, the question remains for every heart to answer: will you walk by the same light that guided the ancients? And will you be part of the generation that sees the promise fully realized?